What happens when a Neopythagorean expert in ancient medical science meets the book of Genesis? Answer: the Great Declaration. The Great Declaration is a philosophical and Gnostic interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3. It's one of the first, if not the first, Christian document to mention aeons in a Gnostic sense, as well as a divine spark. In my view, it was written in early 2nd century Alexandria, where we also find other great 2nd century Christian Gnostics like Valentinus, Carpocrates, and Basilides. In the late 2nd century, the Nicene preacher referred to the declaration as the Word of God. By the early 3rd century, at least, the declaration was attributed to a human medium, none other than the very first reputed Christian Gnostic, Simon of Samaria. In Greek, the Great Declaration is called the apophasis megali. Now, an apophasis can refer to a denial, negation, or a judicial sentence. In the sense of the Great Declaration, it probably refers to an assertion, a decree, or an oracle. We don't know who speaks it, because the human speaker is never identified in what remains of the oracle itself. I will call the human author of the text the declarator, but the divine speaker identified in the text is called the voice and name, which are emanations from the thought of the great and infinite power, the peculiar name for God in this text. In the beginning, there was silence, the divine one, but mind emerged from silence, and from mind came the first and primal thought. Thought has two manifestations in this text, as the daughter of mind, and also as the seventh power, which represents thought perfected and assimilated to the image of her Father. Humanity is not the image of God. Only the seventh power perfectly reflects God. Humans assimilate to God by conforming to the divine likeness, who is the seventh power. The seventh power is clearly divine wisdom or Sophia, but strangely she is never called wisdom in the declaration itself. In this ionic system, we have a primal one giving rise to a monad-dyad pair. All this goes back to Neopythagorean number theory, in which God is viewed as a primal one above the monad, and from the single point of the monad emerges the dyad and all the other numbers. But since the declarator was interpreting the book of Genesis, he only needed to define the first 7 numbers, which are the first 7 days of creation, or rather the primal creations of these days. Incidentally, the declarator is a great example of an early interpreter who doesn't read Genesis literally. The days of creation are not units of time, but they represent aspects of divine intelligence as they cascade through creation. According to the declarator, the heaven and earth mentioned in Genesis 1:1 actually signify mind and thought, mind being the great power. In turn, air and water signify reasoning and conception, while the sun and moon, introduced later, indicate voice and name. These 6 paired powers are called roots or aeons, and they are the first paired aeons that appear in Gnostic Christian lore. There is a 7th power or aeon represented by the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. Since 7 represents perfection or completion, the 7th power is the completion of divine thought, and she is identified as the creatrix. The primal divine mind is called a blazing intellectual fire. Now, the Stoics had identified Zeus, their primal deity, with the mind of the universe, a creative and creating fire. Perhaps the declarator was also inspired by Genesis 1:3, where God makes light, which might overlap with the idea of heavenly fire. The spirit hovering over the waters of chaos in Genesis 1:2 represents the seventh power. As the creatrix, she energizes or orders the waters of chaos, which are a typical symbol of matter. The four other powers seem to be deferred or developed aspects of the primal mind and thought. The product of mind is reasoning or rationality. The product of thought is conception, enthymousis in Greek, which represents the thinking of the heart, a kind of thinking mixed with powerful drives and emotions. Voice is the product of reasoning, and name is a further specification of voice. It is the organization of voice into intelligent speech. These are the fundamental roots of the universe. They are all mental powers. In this sense, the declaration is strongly Platonic in that it asserts the priority of mind over matter. All true realities are mental and conscious on some level. The declarator supports this point with a quotation from Empedocles, who is probably here taken to be a Pythagorean. When the declarator gets to the creation of Adam in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2, he doesn't take it as ancient history or even as ancient myth. He understands it allegorically as referring to human development in the uterus. He probably uses a medical science text of his day, perhaps the Gynecology of Soranus, to identify the elements in paradise with physiological features of the womb. He says, for instance, that Eden represents the placenta, and that the four rivers of paradise in Genesis represent the two veins and the two arteries feeding breath and blood to the fetus through the umbilical cord. The five senses of the fetus are represented in turn by the 5 books of Moses. The turning, flaming sword of Genesis 3 represents the production of semen in men and the producing of milk in women. The declarator was fascinated by images of generation, and he viewed human salvation as the process of maturing human consciousness. But he didn't apparently reject the processes of normal human reproduction in birth. The declarator was a Gnostic who didn't reject sex, that is, but saw love and partnership as part of the eternal aspect of the cosmos, since all the aeons or eternities are paired. The Great Declaration doesn't call itself Gnostic or even use the word gnosis. At the same time, I would classify it as a Gnostic text in the broad sense that it reveals the mysteries of creation, which in antiquity were viewed as elements of special gnosis, here used in the ordinary sense of knowledge. But the declaration does not portray an evil creator or God as the true human or reverse exegesis of Jewish texts. A Gnostic text doesn't imply that it has all the traits of later Sethian or Valentinian texts. If the declaration is our earliest Gnostic Christian text, we wouldn't expect it to have all the later developments, but to contain seeds for some of those later developments, not all of which came to fruition. One peculiar feature of the declaration is its reference to God in 3 phases as the triple standing one who stood, stands, and will stand. In fact, 2 entities get this name, namely mind, the great power, and the 7th power. This makes sense because the 7th power can be seen as the completion or perfection of the undifferentiated mind. Still, the triple designation is intriguing and strange. It combines the idea of divine rest with that of divine development. Divinity rests, but it rests in 3 distinct phases. The triple standing one of the declaration is arguably the first philosophically informed formulation of the Christian Trinity. The declarator is one of the first Christian writers to engage directly with Homer. Dennis MacDonald says that the gospel writers all riffed on Homer, but they never mention him by name. Arguably, the first Christian to directly quote and actually interpret a Homeric text is the declarator. The text he cites is the famous Holy Moly episode. In this scene, the witch Circe has transformed Odysseus's men into pigs. So Hermes pulls a special white plant for Odysseus in the forest so that he can feed it to his friends and change them back into humans. The declarator relates this episode to a miracle of Moses in the desert, in which he makes the bitter waters sweet by the application of a plant. In both cases, a divine miracle produces a holy food or drink which increases the intelligence of the people who consume the element. The declarator treated Moses and Homer almost as equal sites of divine revelation. Homer is called a Gentile poet, but his text was equally ripe for allegory and spiritual interpretation. The divine voice could speak through Homer, and that is exactly the assumption we see among later Simonians who continued to interpret Homer and the Homeric poems as sites of divine revelation. If the Gospels were written by authors riffing on Homer, they could have been written by 2nd century Simonians. Was the declarator a Christian? He never mentions Jesus, at least by name. He mentions the Logos, but identifies it with Moses rather than Jesus. The only distinctly Christian text mentioned by the declarator in what survives is a passage from 1 Corinthians. Perhaps, however, we can add the Wisdom of Solomon, a text that the declarator quotes, and although this text was written by an Alexandrian Jew, it was typically only quoted by Christians in antiquity. Was the declarator perhaps a Jew or a Samaritan? He certainly honored Moses and arguably followed Jewish methods of interpretation. For instance, he seems to prefer the Pentateuch and to interpret passages of the Pentateuch by passages from the prophets, with the prophet Isaiah being a clear favorite. But we should probably define being a Jew or Samaritan in terms of practice, and nothing in the declaration indicates the distinctive practices of Judaism or Samaritanism, that is, following kosher laws, obeying the Sabbath, and keeping peculiar holidays. Christians, of course, could and did appropriate Jewish sacred texts and methods of interpretation. Whoever exactly the declarator was, he or she was a complex thinker, a true polymath, familiar with Neopythagorean number theory, and an expert in ancient embryology. I would identify the declarator as an ancient Christian Gnostic, deeply influenced by Jewish or more broadly Israelite traditions of scriptural interpretation. He or she was one of the earliest Christian Gnostics, probably an inspiration for writers like Valentinus and Vassilides, or at least in conversation with them. The declarator is the first Christian writer to give us paired aeons, and one of the first authors to give us a comprehensive vision of deification. Distinctively, this vision of deification spoken of by the declarator involved not just the deification of the Samarian Simon, but the deification of all people who conform to the seventh power. All people are sparks who can become part of the greater intelligent fire. They are all complex shapes and lines that will fold back into the single point of the great power. This vision of deification is radically inclusive in its extent and intense in that it sees humans as gaining full equality with God. Those who conform their minds to the seventh power will become not subordinate gods or angels, but fully equal with God, the divine mind, the great and infinite power. As it says in the declaration, whoever attains the likeness will be in substance, in potential, in magnitude, in finished perfection, one and the same as the unborn and infinite power.